Please take your seats because we are already 5 minutes into our allotted time. I am Edward Mortimer. I have the honour and privilege of chairing this panel on Europe and the Arab revolutions. I am instructed to be very exact in my time management, and there is an additional very good reason for this, in that this panel is due to finish at 7:45. At 8 o'clock, we are all supposed to be in the Grand Hotel Toplice, which I think is more or less 15 minutes walk from here, and we have a reception at which the keynote speaker will be the President of the Republic. So we shall be in trouble, I shall be in trouble anyway, if I don't finish this panel on time. This is the second year of the political upheaval in the Arab world, which of course is Europe's immediate southern neighbour. And I think that the point of this discussion is to see how Europe has reacted to those events, what kind of relationship between Europeans and Arabs we should be aiming for in the future, and how we set about building it. And I would just like to suggest 2 or 3 key issues which I hope will be addressed. First is the European perceptions of the Arabs. I'm glad to see that we have 4 Arab panelists and 1 European and 1 American. My friend Pierre Vimont, who runs the European External Action Service, will, I'm sure, hold up the European end of this balance with great skill. But I think it is really a question of how we look at our southern neighbours. Unfortunately, I think that European attitudes to the Arabs tend to be often either negative or mercenary or both. We see them as often undesirable immigrants. We see them as a source of energy. We see them as an important export market. We see them as an unstable neighbourhood. And I'm afraid we see them as potential terrorists. That's not a very good start for a friendly and productive relationship. Have the Arab revolutions changed those perceptions? My worry is that up to now they haven't really. My second observation is that we talk about Europe all the time, and yet as a political entity Europe is very weak. And its institutions and its governments at the moment are preoccupied with the economic and monetary crisis which was the subject of the previous panel. And there is a question, I think, of which, in these circumstances, which are the European actors? Are they institutions, supranational, multinational institutions? Are they governments? Are they economic actors? Are they maybe civil society actors who can best and most effectively engage with the Arab societies? And thirdly, if we think of this as a dialogue between Europeans and Arabs, who is included on each side? We don't actually have a Turk on this panel, but I think there may be Turks in the room. We had a Turk on the youth panel last night. I think it's a very important question, thank you, whether Europe considers itself as including Turkey when it addresses the other side of the Mediterranean. Certainly, if you look at the map, Turkey is definitely on our side of the Mediterranean. But similarly, is this a Mediterranean dialogue, or is it a dialogue with the whole Arab world? Because, of course, the Arab world extends into Iraq and the Arabian Peninsula, and there are a whole range of different kinds of relationship, maybe, that you can have with the countries, for example, of the Gulf. And most of the major oil producers, of course, are in that region. So I think that's an important question. And finally, I think you have to ask, where does Israel fit in? It is a Mediterranean country. It is neither a European nor an Arab country, but I doubt that any successful Euro-Arab relationship can be built without finding a way to manage, if not to solve, the Israeli-Palestinian problem. So, having given that short introduction, let me turn to our panelists. They are very distinguished people. I'm sure they have all given very long speeches in one environment or another. I have told them, because I have been told, that this is not the occasion for such speeches, that they should each make a short opening statement of not more than 5 minutes, and then we will have an interactive discussion in which you, the audience, can join. So the first whom I will call on is His Excellency Dr. Riyad al-Malki, who is the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Palestinian National Authority. He was reappointed to that post in May of this year, but he has held various portfolios in the authority since 2007. Before that, he was a professor of engineering, I think I'm right in saying, at BSF University on the West Bank, and he has been a known and respected participant in efforts to achieve peace between Palestinians and Israelis for a very long time. So I'm delighted to offer him the floor.
Thank you very much. I would like to see the things from a different perspective, if you may allow me to do so. From the first day onward, Europe tried to name the Arab revolutions as an Arab Spring. And they labeled what was happening in our region as an Arab Spring. A reflection of being hopeful, being reflective, even, expecting the repetition of different springs within Europe, and even, sometimes some nostalgia. So it's very clear that from day one, Europe tried to influence, if not by action, at least by naming the event that was really happening. And this is really the birth of the connection between Europe and between what was supposed to happen within the Arab region, being Arab Spring, being Arab revolutions, being Arab uprising, what have you. But this really was the case. So I wanted just to throw this idea first. Europe was very hopeful for democratic changes, but also Europe was very fearful from the control of political Islam to the whole region. And this is really the second point regarding Europe. What Arab Spring could mean to Europe? They were offering Europe different perspective. First of all, they offered Europe democratic transformation within the Arab region. Didn't happen before. They were offering Europe political tolerance, because this was lacking very clearly within the Arab countries for many years, and even possible, acceptance of Israel's right to exist. This political tolerance will deliver later, probably, security and regional peace. So from that perspective, one should really look at it. Third point is that Arab Spring could produce, possibly, European economic recovery, because the total devastation of the existing infrastructure in countries like Libya requires reconstruction. And who's going to do that? The countries who participated in getting rid of Gaddafi. And who were there? The airplanes that really smashed Gaddafi's force. France, Italy, UK, US, etc. So this is really another possibility for European economic recovery through really trying to rebuild the country after being totally destroyed. And this will require billions, tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars that they are available, in Libya, they are available in other countries within the region. And fourthly, what is really important is possible fair redistribution of Arab wealth, because this fair redistribution of Arab wealth might reduce the flow of immigration from Arab countries, north of Africa, towards Europe. These are elements that should be seen as a possible outcome of this Arab Spring and what Arab Spring could really produce. Now, it is important regarding what we have seen in Egypt, in Libya, we are seeing in Syria and others, to try to understand what the Arab Spring is producing in terms of the type of state that will emerge. And I'm very much worried, and I should really share this with the audience, because it's very important to see what type of states that they are really emerging in most of these what's called Arab Spring. Not necessarily all, but most of them. First of all, it's possible that we might see, and we are seeing, sectarian and ethnic states. Sectarian and ethnic states emerging in Arabic, dual al-tawa'if, that they are emerging. And this is really very dangerous and very worrisome. Two, it's possible that we start to see divided states, dual inhilal, that will be divided into pieces. And possible that we will see in the near future that scenario happening, not only in one country, but more than one. And third, we might see what's called failed state, dawla al-fashila in Arabic, failed state, that it will stay as state, but has no function, no ability to move, no response, what have you. And Syria today is moving into that failed state if the situation reaches a point where total destruction and nothing else will happen. So these are really the possible scenarios, the type of states that could really emerge. Fourthly, could be a combination of any of the three states that could really emerge within the Arab Spring. And that's why Europe has to be worried. Europe has to see what role should really take. Can Europe live with such states? Or another way, what if Europe favors one of these states against the others? I think this is really very important. I believe that one has really to look into these matters carefully, deeply, study all these developments, and try really to understand before rush things, and before also waiting that long, allowing things to settle down, and then it's going to be irreversible action when it comes to this matter. I will stop here, but I have more other issues to contribute.
Thank you very much, Minister. I really appreciate that example of self-discipline on your part, and I hope the others will follow it. Let me turn now to Mr. Tuhami Abdouli, who is the State Secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Tunisia. Some of you already know him because he spoke to the Youth Forum at the reception last night. He's also an academic. He is a specialist in civilization and cultural anthropology, and he has taught extensively in Europe, and indeed, until he became a minister, he was vice president of the Euro-Mediterranean University, which I think is an institution of the European Union, in fact. So he is extremely well qualified to address the problems that concern us this evening. Please.
Thanks a lot. I will be very practical and pragmatic. That's why I didn't title my speech, Time for Revolution of the Economy. In fact, I would like to draw your attention to the necessity of changing the perspective. You did mention it before, earlier. After the so-called Primavera Araba or the Arabic Spring, I would rather use this another term, which is the Arabic Renaissance through revolution. As we have definitely to answer the expectations of people in both the Southern Rim and the Northern Rim. There are some reasons of the Arab Revolution. First, the freedom and dignity were and still are the burning desire for the Arabic revolutions. Thus, we need to revolutionize the economy in order to answer the expectations. Second, we need also to change the vision, and we need to change the structure, not the roles. I am afraid, and this is also another worry, that we changed the robe of corrupted people with other robes, and I mean precisely some Islamic political tendencies, whether in Egypt or in Tunisia or in Syria. There is an axis of evil behind all these revolutions that did lead to the revolution. I call it the CDU, I mean corruption, dictatorship, and unemployment. Europe now is suffering of corruption and unemployment. We cannot generalize, but these are some effects. In Tunisia, we were suffering of the CDU, I mean corruption, dictatorship, and unemployment. The problem was how to approach corruption and how can we define corruption. There are a lot of perspectives. One is structural, so corruption is negative characteristic, such as underdevelopment, poverty, ignorance, fundamentalism, and repression of women. It's also seen as a social pathology because of the lack of the protection of the state and the social intervention. The most important approach is what I call the interactional approach, which focuses on the behavior of actors, in particular public offices, public office settings, which is, and then it could be described as a behavior that deviates from the formal duties of a public role in favor of private or personal gain. So the corrupt behavior could be by using offices to promote business, creates an informal black market. This is what had been happening in Tunisia. And the corruption in Tunisia was on the facet of a certain kind of relation between the master and disciples. The master was Ben Ali, and the disciples were all those who were surrounding him, and also the middlemen between Tunisian people and people from Europe and people from Arab Islamic countries and people from the USA. Because of corruption, our economy was serving a pack of thieves. And after the revolution, for us now, it is a moment to take into consideration this and rethinking the economy. We did agree, in fact, or we had agreed, that energizing the economy should be a process to achieve a revolution in the economy and for revolutionaries. And this could be by 5 steps. One is, or the first one is economy for employment and employability. It's good to have a diploma, but it is better to have a job. Second is economy not to sacrifice people, but to finance projects for people. Third is economy that serves social, civil beings, not economic beings. Fourth is economy of anti-corruption, not for corruption. Fifth is the new economic social contract based on consensus, not economic deals. And in order to achieve these goals, we now in Tunisia, we are in a general mobilization, and let me call you to a Mediterranean mobilization for an economy of revolution where all of us affirm our equal presence, ambitions, and interests. In Tunisia, till now, the revolution is a process, not an achievement. It is the ongoing revolution. Still a lot of things to be done, and especially the European contribution is urgent. As, this is a great proverb, it takes two to tango, I mean Europe and other countries of the Arab revolutions. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed. I don't know whether you have tried this CDU to a German audience. You might get a slightly different reaction. But let me turn now to Pierre Vimont, who is the Executive Secretary General, as I think I already said, of the European External Action Service, which is the kind of embryo foreign ministry of the European Union. Before that, he held many important posts in the French Foreign Ministry, most recently as ambassador to the United States. Pierre.
Thank you very much. I don't know if it's working. Push, sorry. Thank you very much, and I'll try to be as short as possible, and maybe to pick up some of your questions that you put at the beginning, if only to be a little bit controversial, so that we can enjoy ourselves here on the platform. Maybe taking up two of your first questions and trying to think a little bit more about this. There are two main criticisms I think we're hearing at the moment. One coming from our Arab partners, namely European Union has made a lot of promises, but nothing has really come out in terms of financial resources and concrete action so far. And the other one that we're seeing slowly creeping in from the European side, which is all that has happened with this Arab Renaissance or Arab Spring is all very well, but when we look at the situation as it is, we're seeing a lot of political uncertainty, major shortcomings, and therefore, was it really worthwhile? I think, as always, when you're looking at these criticisms and you're living in the real world, there is a little bit of truth in these criticisms, but there is also a lot that needs to be corrected. Europe hasn't done enough. Of course, we haven't done enough. We should do much more. But one has to understand that in all what is happening today, time is of the essence. We are in the process of going ahead with a lot of what we put on our agenda with our Arab partners, and that was embodied, I think, in March of last year, which was a communication by the Commission and the High Representative. And that went on through the whole list of what we intended to do, whether it be free trade agreements, whether it be agreements on the mobility and immigration, whether it be financial assistance, or whatever it is, public health, infrastructure, etc., etc. All this is moving on, maybe not at the right speed, but this takes time. And we're facing, of course, new governments that also need to gain a little bit of experience. When you have governments in some of those Arab partners, you're still waiting for governments to appear. So that takes time, and one has to understand that in spite of all the goodwill that does exist, we need more time. Think about the IMF. They have been, for instance, discussing with Egypt now for more than 1 year the possibility of financial assistance. We're not yet there, and it is very much needed by Egypt. So there's not lack of enthusiasm on the Egyptian side. I think there's goodwill also in the IMF, but all these discussions, very technical ones, take time. So I think we have to be aware of that. On the other side, from the European perspective, this criticism about political Islam is something also, I think, that is missing the sense of history and the sense of time that is needed there also. After all, if you look at the way democracy came back to Latin America, for instance, it wasn't done in one day. It took a lot of time. And by the way, many of the features you're seeing today in some of the Arab countries, for instance, the high number of new political parties popping up nearly every day. If you look at what happened in Chile, Argentina, or Brazil, it was more or less exactly the same phenomenon. Of course, each country is different, and one should not try to compare too easily. But I think we have to take that into account, and a little bit of patience may be necessary. I still think anyway, and this is my second point I wanted to put forward, is that Europe still has some homework to do with regard to the Arab Spring. And I wouldn't like to take too much time, but just to pinpoint some of the things I think we still need to do in order to help the Arab Spring to move from this period or time of uncertainty or instability towards a more solid ground. I think the first thing, of course, is maybe a new mindset from the Europeans, and to understand that what's happening with the Arab Spring is quite different from what happened, for instance, in the 1990s with the European Central and Eastern partners, because what was happening there at the time was mostly setting up a process that was slowly moving towards accession. That was rather easy to see and easy to be done. Here it's much more complicated, and I'll come back in a second about another problems that we're facing. But here we're finding a totally different complex process that is going on which the Europeans have to be, I think, much more humbled and much more in a listening mood than we have been maybe in the previous time. And it's important to be aware of that, because also we're living, and this has been said time and again with the previous panel, we're living in a total different world from the 1990s. This is a global world in which we're living, where around the Mediterranean, the European Union has felt that they had a sort of exclusive partnership with its Arab partners, but that's not the case. We have many other countries that are coming in and very much interested in helping the Arab Spring countries to move ahead. Think about Brazil. Think about India, think about South Africa, and many others. Think about Turkey, that Edward mentioned a few minutes ago. So all this makes it a totally different situation to which I think we have to adapt ourselves in a totally different way, with a much more new approach, much more in a listening mode, listening to countries for whom this revolution that took place was also how to regain dignity and sovereignty, and I think it's very important for us to keep that in mind. But I think the other point we have to think a little bit more about is the sense of purpose of what we're doing. As I was saying previously with regard to our Eastern or Central European partners, when we started with them after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the whole process that went towards accession, we knew where we were going. Accession was the ultimate goal. We had a long experience about that with former accession processes. Here, as we can't think about that because nobody is thinking about accession, we have to invent something different, something that has a lot more to deal with a new kind of partnership. And in the end, when you're looking at this with a little bit of insight and looking at the history of what Europeans have tried to do with the Mediterranean countries, you find out that we've always had problems in defining the partnership we wanted with our Mediterranean partners. Whether it be the Barcelona process, then the Union for Mediterranean, and even before we could name a lot of others, all these attempts, all these tries that we went on have never given exactly the result we were hoping for. And I think now that we're entering a new phase with our partners from around the Mediterranean, I think we have to be able to think with them about precisely the kind of commitment, objectives we want to pursue all together, whether it be how to move towards a stabilized democracy in those countries, how can we help them with economic perspective and economic prosperity, how can we think about collective security also in the region, how can we work with all of them. I'm not talking about new institutions. I think we've had enough of that. I'm thinking more about how do we coordinate all the initiatives that are taking place already around the Mediterranean Sea, and how we can come up with a sense of purpose, once again, a better understanding, a political guideline about what we want to achieve together. I think this is where we have to work much more in the months and years to come. It won't be easy, it's complicated. There are a lot of differences around this zone, but I think this is really what we should try to achieve as we move along.
Thank you very much indeed. And now let me turn to Wadi Abu Nasser. Those of you who were here last year will remember him. He was on a similar panel, which I also had the honor to chair. He's the founder and director of the Organization for Democracy. He's the founder and director of the International Center for Consultations in Israel. He's a leading member of the Christian community in Israel, which, as I'm sure you know, is essentially an Arab community. And he acted as the media coordinator for Pope Benedict's pilgrimage to the Holy Land in 2009. Well,
thank you very much. I'm intending to be a little bit critical, and I will talk about 3 points. First, who is Europe? What about Russia? One could not ignore the Russian role, especially in the Middle East. Second, about the EU. The EU, with the 27 member states, there are countries who report to US before reporting to Brussels. And the EU sometimes look like the Arab League. It is a little bit more organized than the Arabs, but not much. So I believe there is a challenge here, that first, there is a need for better European understanding to the region. In foreign policy, I believe that there is a need for further effort. I am aware of the great effort and in the transition, now that Brussels, especially after Lisbon, etc., that there is now serious effort. But I believe that many times, and I can tell you, I met recently some politicians from key important countries who wanted to go to some Arab countries to help in promoting democracy. And when I asked them, what do you know about these countries? It was funny, it is like talking to somebody that asking me about Micronesia. So I know that there is good intention, there is goodwill, but the road to hell is full of goodwill. So therefore, some reflection and serious study is required. And we should not generalize. This Arab Spring, I don't want to use tough words, but it has no real meaning. We cannot talk about similar model in Tunisia and in Egypt, in Syria, in Yemen. We are talking about transition period. To a certain sense, I don't want to make generalization, but to a certain sense, I could say that the Arab world now is medieval Europe, is moving out from the emirs era towards democracy. It will not take 1 year. It is not a spring. It is not a seasonal issue. It will take decades if we are lucky. And unfortunately, unlike Europe of the medieval ages, we have a lot of foreign players playing most of the time not necessarily positively. Willingly, unwillingly, it is something else. Now, unfortunately also, there is another element, which is Israel. If we wish or not, Israel is a player. Directly, indirectly is a player. When Europe is treating Israel, or the EU, to be more, is treating Israel in one way, and treating the Arabs, mainly the weak Arabs, in another way, its credibility close to zero. You know, by the way, there are jokes in the Israeli Foreign Ministry about the EU sometimes that these guys are lions in Ramallah, rabbits in Tel Aviv. So it is very sad, you know, but if I am an Arab and I see a blind eye turned about the systematic discrimination against the Arab population in Israel, sometimes there is shy report, one here, one there, you know, and we leak it. We don't dare to say about it, to talk about it publicly. We just leak it. So if you leak it, just hide. I cannot respect somebody who wants to teach democracy and who is not giving a clear, I don't want to say a red color, but at least an orange color to a country which pretends to be the only democracy of the Middle East. So either you are for human rights everywhere or not. You cannot be comme ci, comme ça, because the people are not blind anymore, especially with the internet era. And I believe here Israel is unique creature in the world. As such, it needs unique treatment. Israel, especially the Zionist movement, succeeded to make this combination between Judaism and Israel. If you criticize Israel, you will be accused to be anti-Semite. No. We have to make it clear that Israel is very unique, but simultaneously there are keys to address the Israelis. And I admit that we Arabs, as Europeans, so far we failed to address Israel. Israel, if we want to achieve something in it, it is like a turtle. It is not easy. But we have to work from within. And there are 5 keys ruling Israel: rabbis, generals, businessmen, journalists, and mayors. If we want something in Israel, we have to address those systematically, not a flash and disappear. Systematically, it is not easy. The people think that they are immune. It will take time. But if I am a European diplomat, I will not come for a photo opportunity with Netanyahu. I have to work more with these 5 categories and in very systematic and well-studied way. Now, the last point that I would like to talk is that about the Arab revolutions. It is difficult now to speak that the Arabs are necessarily in need of teachers to teach them what is democracy. You know, it is really difficult because we cannot come with 500 years of European experience and bring it as a package, please take it. And now we discover that, unfortunately, the EU, sometimes because of these internal debates and sometimes the lack of consistent politics, they found themselves the tail of the Americans who are the tails of Netanyahu associates. You know, sometimes people say, you know, in the Likud party, we don't know if Obama works for us or for our secretary. And, you know, not to talk about the EU. The EU is a dust, you know, like the Arabs, you know. So, but this arrogant approach in Israel doesn't justify that the Arabs not to learn the lesson. The lesson is very clear, that Arabs have to be assisted not necessarily by meddling in their affairs. Because again, each country, each society has its own history, has its own composition. Like, we cannot compare what is happening in Syria, where sectarian calculations play a role, with the situation in Tunisia, where sectarian issues are not a player at all. So therefore, I do believe that the Arab revolutions, it is more a transition period that will take time and requires a lot of patience, but above all, it requires a lot of understanding. Unfortunately, major part of the problem in our region, I can talk that we have actually now 2 major parts: crisis of leadership and a crisis of understanding. Crisis of leadership, I believe it is a worldwide phenomenon. But at least in Israel, Palestine, the giant leaders disappeared without stabilizing the issue. Therefore, we are in a kind of turmoil. And now, since Prime Minister Netanyahu is not interested really in any dialogue with any Arab, so he is gaining time, and he has some employees here and there working for him. The second issue is the lack of understanding. Unfortunately, between Arabs and Jews, again, I don't want to generalize, but there are two major streams. Amongst the Arabs and even Muslims, if I want to simplify, I could say there is one school which overestimates Israel, as if Israel is a giant that we have to kiss its feet. Or there are those who underestimate Israel, as if Israel will collapse. Leave it, it will collapse by itself. On the other hand, there are two schools in Israel. One school underestimates the Arabs. Oh, the Arabs are stupid. We are the brilliant. We should tell them what is good for them. And there are those who overestimate the Arabs. You know, good Arab is a dead Arab, to eliminate. And unfortunately now, so far, we need more efforts for understanding, because usually a Jew learns Arabic in secret services and a Palestinian learns Hebrew in jail. It is not a healthy relationship between two neighbors. You see, I believe we have to invest more efforts for mutual understanding, and the same of Europe. If Europe, EU wants to play a role, it has to invest more effort to understand. And I do believe to understand, solving the Israeli-Palestinian issue is a key issue for stability in the Middle East. And I tell you more than that, and with this I would like to conclude. I believe that Israel committed a fatal strategic mistake by not using the opportunity of Yasser Arafat and Hafiz al-Assad to end the conflict. Because if Israel did so, Israel would watch now about the stupid Arabs killing each other. But now, whatever Israel will do, it is part of the problem, and it will suffer. Whatever it will do, Israel will take the consequences, and not necessarily in the positive sense. To conclude, I would like to say things are complicated, but not impossible. We need better understanding and a real comprehensive study of all players with better approach towards Israel. Without that, I do believe that Europe will be part of the problem, not of the solution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, you mentioned, I think it was Netanyahu who you said was a lion in Tel Aviv, no, a lion in Ramallah, but a rabbit in Tel Aviv?
No, it's not Netanyahu. It's some Israeli officials.
Okay, because you also mentioned Hafiz al-Assad, about whom I remember it was said that he was a lion in Lebanon, but a chicken in Golan. And
yes,
this maybe makes a transition because...
this is the reason that Israel is partially silent about Syria. It's not necessarily interested in Bashar going home.
Well, we have another member of the Assad family who is going to speak to us now. I think has a rather different point of view. Rival al-Assad is the founder and director of the Organization for Democracy and Freedom in Syria, which is based in the United Kingdom. And he was born in Syria, but has been exiled since he was a child. He has been active in interfaith dialogue, and in particular has helped facilitate rapprochement between Alawites and Sunnis in North Lebanon. I don't know how far that rapprochement has gone, because I seem still to read about some unfortunate events, but it would be, and I'm not sure whether that is relevant to our theme or not, but anyway, we are very interested to hear what you have to say.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mortimer. And actually, I prepared a little speech, and I thought I was afraid of being too undiplomatic and too honest, but I think Mr. Wadir beat me to that. So let me start with good evening, everyone. It's an honor to be speaking to you all at a forum whose ethos is fundamentally democratic. Freedom and democracy in Syria and the Middle East are not just my subject, but the focus of my life and work. As a Syrian living in exile since the age of 9, it saddens me to watch Syria plummeting into a state of civil war. I remain passionate about my home, its people, and their traditional values of cross-cultural and religious understanding. It is easy to forget that the opposition to the incumbent regime began peacefully as part of the much-heralded Arab Spring. The slide into violence and retribution was started by the response of a brutal incumbent regime with weak leadership. It has escalated because the opposition has been divided and influenced by a convergence of external factors. The complexity of these factors has made it easy for the outside world to label this as a war between evil and good. This analysis is not only oversimplified, but misleading. The regime is tyrannical and barbaric, but the opposition has been divided from the start and has been hijacked by terrorist, extremist, and geopolitical interests, which is why all efforts to create a peaceful democratic solution have failed. In essence, there are three tiers of conflict in and around Syria: the local, the regional, and the global. All three are interwoven, but it is vital to understand how they have combined to create the current maelstrom of violence. At the very highest level, there have been a growing escalations of tension between Russia and China against the US and NATO. Dmitry Medvedev has repeatedly warned that time was running out for the West to secure Russia's agreement to a missile defense shield in Europe. As president, he warned in May about the dangers of military intervention in Syria or Iran. He said, at some point, some actions which undermine state sovereignty may lead to a full-scale nuclear regional war. The Middle East remains a flashpoint of Cold War enmity, and with Syria in flux, it is reported Russian and Chinese ships now patrol the waters of the eastern Mediterranean, close to military vessels from the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and Germany. Since the start of the uprising, Russia has supplied Syria with arms, including surface-to-air missiles and surface-to-sea missiles, and 3 million gas masks. Russia's alliance with China has manifested itself in combined naval activities in the South China Sea and 3 vetoes of UN resolutions on Syria. Beijing, meanwhile, has created what it perceives to be a US policy of military and economic encirclement. Recently, the US and its allies conducted military exercises in Jordan to enhance their abilities to meet security challenges. On a regional level, a growing schism can be observed throughout the Muslim world. The fault lines are drawn on sectarian grounds, with an Iranian-led Shia axis forming through Baghdad, Beirut, and Damascus, backed by Russia and China for a number of strategic and economic reasons, of course. They are facing up to a Turkish-led Sunni axis encompassing Saudi Arabia and Qatar, and backed implicitly at least by the US and NATO. The growing enmity between Turkey and Iran has also been fueled by economic, strategic, and political factors as they compete for regional hegemony. As a result, all of this, a proxy war, is already being fought in the country and has been for some time. Unfortunately, as with so many complex issues around the world, it is easy for the press and even some politicians with an ear for a soundbite to portray this as the fight between good and evil. The altruistic freedom fighters trying to save innocent people in their opposition to a sadistic dictator murdering his own people. Life is rarely that simple, particularly in the midst of this cauldron of diplomatic and religious tension. And misinterpretation stems from a simple, age-old misguided premise that my enemy's enemy is my friend. In the case of Syria, that means supporting anyone who purports to oppose the regime, irrespective of their motive. In practice, the Syrian opposition has never been unified. For a time, they were purportedly represented internationally by the Syrian National Council, which is now recognized as a facade for the Muslim Brotherhood, as stated by former member Kamal al-Labwani. The Syrian National Council is divisive and divided. It has never been an inclusive opposition. It could not have been further from being democratic. The latest person to resign from the Syrian National Council is Basma Qudmani, who was one of the few women in the Syrian National Council and head of its Foreign Affairs Bureau. This week she said that the SNC has effectively failed and should be replaced by a new political authority. And I absolutely agree with her. But there is irrefutable evidence that Saudis and Qataris are investing petrodollars to provide some of the opposition with arms. It is far from a homogeneous opposition fighting on behalf of the Syrian people, more a collection of groups, including militants and brutal fundamentalists. The evidence now clearly shows that what I have been saying for over a year, that there is al-Qaeda infiltration and other terrorist groups have and are joining the armed opposition, including many foreign fighters. These extremists continue to be called to action by Islamic clerics on Saudi-owned Wisal and Safa satellite TV channel. From my perspective, much time is currently being wasted in making distinctions between the influence in Syria of al-Qaeda or non-al-Qaeda affiliates, Salafi Wahhabi groups. They are all Islamist jihadist groups, radicalizing and militarizing the conflict further, and the conflict will not end until this stops. While it continues, innocent groups continue to suffer, as illustrated by the exodus of Christians taking place in certain parts of Syria. This situation is made worse by the statements of people such as the Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia, who called for all churches across the region to be destroyed. Syria is now exporting issues too. The conflict is spreading. Violence from the Syrian conflict has spilled over to Lebanon and Turkey. The tragic failure of the Kofi Annan plan requires little further explanation. The plan was undermined by the parties and states involved not acting in good faith. 1 week after the international community agreed on the plan, Qatar and Saudi Arabia decided at the Friends of Syria meeting in Turkey to fund the Free Syrian Army and called for weapons to be given to the opposition, which has led to a disastrous intensification of the conflict. I was entirely in agreement with the plan, all of which makes the behavior of the US, Britain, and much of Europe hard to interpret. At best, it is misguided. At worst, it is hypocritical. A shaft of light has been forthcoming in Secretary Clinton's recent statement that the US was warning countries not to send jihadists into Syria. But those good words fly in the face of her turning a blind eye to Saudi and Qatar doing just that. More recently, the US media has reported President Obama assigning a covert order authorizing the CIA to support the Syrian rebels. The opposition is now receiving portable Stinger surface-to-air missiles. We can only guess where it will end. William Hague has asserted that Britain has sent £5 million of non-lethal aid. If this was all directed towards medicine, then peace might have a chance. But when it funds body armor and communications equipment, then a fine line is being trodden, particularly when they can be used in conjunction with the lethal aid from Saudi and Qatar. Peace is currently a distant dream, but not a dream that is being pursued by the majority of the international community. Syria has become a pawn into a geopolitical chess game. That game is turning ever more violent and sinister, with the regime willing to do anything to stay in power and an opposition being funded to fight them by international influences ramping up the aggression. Syria has become a magnet for sectarian hatred, and an all-out civil war leading to a regional war beckons. But at some stage, discussions will begin. It is vital that, irrespective of their diplomatic agendas, Western countries work solely in the interest of the Syrian people, including its minorities. This means that arming of the opposition must be discouraged in the strongest terms. It means condemning states and extremist clerics, advocating the murder of minorities. It means ensuring that Syrian institutions stay intact and that the regime, the opposition, and their outside backers are pressured into acting in good faith and supporting diplomacy. Finally, and most urgently, it means enticing the Syrian opposition to finally come onto one platform and speak with one voice so an all-inclusive, peaceful, democratic transition can take place. An opposition is not worth supporting simply because of the regime it opposes. It must be encouraged to find a common purpose and unite. That presents Syria's best and only hope for a peaceful future. Thank you very much. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much indeed. And we turn now to our last panelist, which is Mark Donfried, at the far end. You may notice that the organizers have assembled 3 panelists here who are founder directors of their organization. This was the case of Wadi, it's the case of Ribal, and it's the case of Mark, who is the director and founder of the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy in New York. He studied European history and French at the University of Columbia, and then he went to Sciences Po in Paris, where he wrote a thesis on La diplomatie du jazz. Now he's based in Berlin, and he's teaching at Humboldt University. So I think obviously some cultural diplomacy is needed in this area, so we await your insights with great interest.
Thank you very much. Your Excellencies, distinguished panelists, distinguished guests, it's really a true honor for me to be here with you. So I would first of all like to thank the organizers for arranging such a panel at I think such a very important time in history to discuss exactly these issues. What I'd like to do now very briefly is just take one question from the proposal that we received from the panel, outline three things that I think make the post-2011 Arab Spring Revolution period very unique, and then give you an answer where I'd like to give three examples, one from Egypt, one from Afghanistan, and one from Palestine, that give me hope in terms of where actually the future is going. The question I'd like to deal with is how do we build trust between Europe and Arab countries, as well as between Europe and the rest of the world, in this very unique context that was so eloquently explained by my colleagues, a context of corruption, dictatorship, unemployment, economic crisis, the Syrian crisis. How can we conceive and possibly build trust in such a chaotic and such a difficult environment? I think before I answer that question, I'd like to discuss very briefly this framework. What is the situation that we currently find ourselves, or what have we learned from the Arab Spring transitions or renaissance, as my colleague put it? I think three things we need to take into consideration before we answer that question. First of all, we've seen a power shift in the sense now suddenly youth and civil society seem to matter more than ever before. They have a voice that for a long time they didn't have, for a number of reasons, but I think that's the first point in terms of the target audience of our cultural diplomacies or our policies has changed. It's no longer necessarily at the top, but it's very much actually from the bottom up in terms of how one can actually have an impact on youth and civil society. So I think that's one thing that makes this period unique. Secondly, I would say the digital divide is over. For a long time, we would speak about a digital divide between those elites in the world who had access to digital technologies, those who don't. Today, we actually have more cell phones in the world than toilets, meaning in that sense we actually have access to technology in a much greater way than ever before. And I think that's not the only reason why the Arab revolutions took place and were so successful, but it's an important reason in the sense suddenly there's an accessibility that was not there before. So I think that changes also the paradigm. We have to also change our policies. So I would say the digital divide in that sense is over, or at least to a large degree. Finally, I think we have to recognize not necessarily Europe's irrelevance, but I think maybe the growing irrelevance, especially in the context of China. As we look at actually, let's say, Arab Spring countries or Africa, they have options today, and I think Europe needs to realize the fact that they can't continue with this policy necessarily of preaching, whether it's human rights, democracy, the same way that they have in the past. I think for many countries, especially in Northern Africa and beyond, China is a very attractive partner because they don't necessarily have the same strings attached that many European development aid policies do, in the sense they go there and they just build the roads, they get the job done. Whereas traditionally Europe has always come and said, okay, we will invest this and this if you do A, B, C. So in that sense, again, I don't want to criticize Europe here, but I think Europe does need to realize that the tables have changed a little bit, and whether it's cultural diplomacy or development aid or other policies, one does need to have a different approach. One of my colleagues mentioned also this aspect of humility, which I think is very, very important. So my partial response to this question of how we can try to build trust in this very unique and very challenging context is probably not as a surprise to you, I would say cultural diplomacy, not alone, but really together with the other policies. But I want to talk about specifically a certain kind of cultural diplomacy, which is quite different from what I would consider classical cultural diplomacy. Many of us are probably familiar with the classical examples, British Council, Alliance Française, Goethe Institute, the very famous examples such as the jazz ambassadors in the Cold War period, where cultural diplomacy, I would say, of the past was primarily governmental and was primarily about how do we tell our story to the world, how do we make others like us, how do we change the way our countries are perceived abroad. It was very much about speaking and not so much about listening. That I would consider is really cultural diplomacy of the past. Not necessarily the institutions that I mentioned, but that idea, this idea of somehow persuasion. And I think really today, if we ask ourselves the question, what is the main difference between an individual in Europe and an individual in one of the Arab countries or the Middle East? I would say the main difference is actually access. Some individuals in the world have access to what they want and what they need. Some individuals don't have access to what they want and what they need. And technically, that actually should be the job of local, national, and global governance, merely to provide that access. And I would say the cultural diplomacy of the future should have the same thesis. First of all, it should be about partnership, so it should be the public sector working with the private sector and civil society. Secondly, it should be about access. And what I mean by that is it shouldn't be a cultural diplomacy trying to preach and say Germany is like this, or France is like that, or the USA is like that, but really a cultural diplomacy that actually assists in enabling access. And I'll give you 3 examples of how that might be accomplished. First of all, as we look at Egypt, we have to ask ourselves, why was it such a surprise, these protests? Why was it that really this Tahrir Square took the world by storm? And I think there, part of the explanation, I think, lies in the cultural diplomacy policies, which up until then were really very much about projecting certain images, about telling our story to the world. What if we had a different kind of cultural diplomacy, which was more about intake, less about output, in the sense of cultural diplomacy, which was, for example, providing access to the Egyptian movies at the time. One of my colleagues earlier mentioned the Jacobean Building, which is a very famous book, but also a movie in Egypt. If we had been reading books like that, if we had been listening to the music, whether it's the hip-hop music or the other music forms, and if we had been actually listening to the artists and the poets of Egypt, we definitely could have seen this coming much, much earlier. And I don't want to say we necessarily would have known exactly when, but I think there were many insights there that were completely ignored. So I think that's one example where a different kind of cultural diplomacy, I think, could have assisted, at least in preparing for some of the transitions that were coming. Second example is Afghanistan. Many of you may have heard of the film that was actually made based on a movie or a TV series in Afghanistan, Afghan Star, which is sort of the Afghan equivalent of Britain's Got Talent or American Idol. Professor Cynthia Schneider at Georgetown University is on our board of directors. She has the thesis that this TV show, Afghan Star, is actually assisting in bringing democracy to Afghanistan, even though that's not at all the intention of the show. And if you think about this TV show, it's very democratic. First of all, men and women have equal access to the show in terms of participating, competing, etc. Secondly, everyone votes via SMS. So not everyone necessarily has an internet connection at home, but almost everyone has at least one, if not two, cell phones in Afghanistan. So suddenly you have participation of the masses in a very democratic process, doing something they enjoy. So again, that's not necessarily the intention of the Afghan Star TV show, which was actually two Afghani entrepreneurs who started it. But it's interesting to see how something cultural can very often serve as a way of actually accomplishing other goals. So just to get us thinking, maybe indirectly, things can be done, actually, that cannot be done by traditional policies in terms of politics or economics. Final example I want to give is actually from ICD. We sent Institute for Cultural Diplomacy peace delegation to Israel not too long ago, headed by the president of our Young Leaders Forum, who's the former foreign minister of Turkey, Yasser Yakesh, who's also one of the founding members of the ruling party, the AKP party. Fascinating trip, in particular 3 meetings, where we had a private meeting with President Shimon Peres, also with Foreign Minister Lieberman, most interestingly with an organization that actually began in Palestine called the Yalla Young Leaders. The Yalla Young Leaders is a group of young leaders began in Palestine initially, about a year ago, the Arab Revolution time. And essentially, it's a group initially of Palestinians. Now it's 160,000 members across the Middle East, Northern Africa region, of Israelis, of Palestinians, of Moroccans, of Algerians, of Turkish, very, very international group who essentially is dedicated to peace. So instead of going on the streets and protesting, in what some would say is maybe a destructive effort, they're actually trying to have constructive contributions. ICD had the honor of hosting them last week in Berlin. It was actually the first physical meeting of this group that they had ever had. Due to the political context, of course, it's very difficult for such group to actually meet in Israel and Palestine in the region. So it was an amazing experience where we really saw, first of all, going back to the first points I mentioned, the youth coming together. Secondly, making use of essentially social media. It's primarily a Facebook-based organization, really making concrete steps to a solution. So I think that gives me hope that I think even in situations where many have given up in the world, I think definitely as we look to the electronic social media, as we look to the youth, I think steps can be made to actually make contributions in the future. So that's one way how one might consider trying to make contributions to building trust between Europe and the Arab countries, but as well as between the Arab countries and the Middle East themselves. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you all. I'm afraid I failed again because 6 times 5 is 30, but somehow we've taken 55 minutes on, and I didn't know. I don't think any one person went very far over the time limit, but it all adds up. And we only have 20 minutes left. So I think I will turn to you, the audience. I'm afraid I have to start by making the same observation that I made last night at the youth panel. There is something very wrong with this panel. And I expect some members of the audience have noticed it. Or they may not have, because actually the same thing was wrong with all the panels today. And I can't understand how it happens, because all this forum is organized by a brilliant woman, Miriam Mojgan, but she obviously has a view that women should run things and men should be allowed to talk. Well, I think that women should have something to say on the issues we've been discussing, so if any woman in the audience has something to say, I will call on her first. I think I see the minister from Rwanda has her hand up.
Thank you. I just got up because you said you wanted a woman to say something, but also because I represent a country that has the highest percentage of women parliamentarians in the world since 2003. And but I thought I was the only one who noticed that the panel was quite skewed to one side. But since you have come to the same recognition, I think everybody else perhaps had noticed. The parliamentary representation is 56.25%, which is a tremendous improvement from since 2003 when we had 47.5% that we passed Sweden, which was at 45%. It goes across the board. I didn't want to say anything beyond that, but just to say that women or soft power perhaps is what is required to change or to tilt the world from the brink. The faster countries recognize that, the better. And I think the tremendous progress we have seen in my country is, to a large extent, attributable to the great work that women have done. So I hope to see more of that happening around the world as well. Thank you.
I'm going to let the panel respond in a moment, but I also promised to, where is Faris? Yes. You will recognize Faris by his very stylish costume, which I can reveal was lent to him by the British ambassador because EasyJet have lost his luggage. He was supposed to be on the youth panel last night, but he couldn't come because Lufthansa was on strike. There is something dysfunctional about Europe, but Faris is a wonderful example, somehow found by the British Council. He's a change maker. He is half Libyan and half Irish, and he will shortly be celebrating his 18th birthday, but I think he already has more interesting things to say than many people twice or three times his age. So, please.
Thank you. I noticed a few of you referenced political Islam, and you obviously are aware of the threat it has on Europe. And political Islam at the moment across the Middle East is becoming increasingly popular among youth. So I want to know, what do you think us youth can do to combat political Islam? Thank you.
And I can see that Mohammed Al-Abdallah is very anxious to get a word in. He was also on the panel last night for the youth panel on this same topic.
Could you repeat his question, please?
Faris' question.
Sorry, Faris's question, he wanted to know from the panel what youth could contribute to reducing the influence of Islamic extremism. Political Islam, yes, okay. But let's have your question, and then we'll let the panel reply.
Thank you all. My name is Mohammed Al-Abdallah. I'm a human rights activist from Syria. I'm a former prisoner in Syria, was subject to torture, military prison twice, with my father, with my brother. We all were in the same military prison for one time, and when my mom died, the neighbors buried my mom. It's not very sad story because it's very common in Syria this time. It's very common. And not only the gender problem in the panel to see Ribal al-Assad here. His father committed crimes against humanity in Hama. He killed 40,000 human beings, wiped down the city. Where's the money you came from with ANN TV, with your business workers? It's our money that your father stolen from our country 30 years ago. He killed lots of people, and I'm asking you here, would you help me to get your father prosecuted in Geneva or in La Haye in the war in charges of crimes against humanity? Your father killed lots of people, and Blood Strategic Fund should be ashamed. This man in the panel here, he has no rights to speak about human rights till we see his father held accountable. He's innocent for now, but he should be held accountable in a fair trial. About 40,000 human beings he killed. I tweeted and Facebooked about you being in this panel. I get 300 comments in 20 minutes. Lots of them saying they're living abroad, exiled, not like you with lots of money from Syrian people. Exiled because of your dad. And they're asking you to ask your dad, where's their parents? from Tadmor prison. Your dad killed 1,000 human beings in Tadmor himself.
With great respect, Mohammed, I don't think this is the appropriate forum for that discussion.
Appropriate forum to have war criminals here representing their father without talking a word about what his father did in the 80s. He killed 40,000 human beings, for God's sake. Human beings are in Europe here.
All right.
Could you imagine a city being wiped down by this man's father? And he's lecturing here about human rights and freedom and dignity. Thank you.
I think you made your point. Thank you very much. Let me now give some of the panelists a chance to reply. I can see that Minister Malki is very anxious to speak.
Thank you. Just, to try to clarify some issues related to what's called the Arab Spring or Arab Renaissance. Many people believe or still think that what the Arabs need today is lessons about democracy and how to behave, how to govern themselves, how to hold elections. And many countries, they rush to teach us about doing so. But I wanted really to remind everybody exactly when these events really started in Tunisia or even started, in Egypt. They were not about democracy. They were not about elections. They were about jobs, about reducing poverty. They were about fair treatment. They were really about fair distribution of wealth, about equal opportunities. This really was the case. Bouaziz, in Tunis, was really looking for a job, and because he was really prevented to try to get the basic for his family, he committed that action. And then, of course, in Egypt, the people who took the streets in Egypt at the beginning, they were asking for what? For food. They were asking for jobs. They were asking for, opportunities to work, to improve themselves. They were not really asking for anything else. They were not asking for democracy. Now, of course, democracy is given. It comes, with everything else. But that was not the essential request by the people who initiated the revolution in Tunis and the revolution in Egypt. So it's very important for us to understand this and try to comprehend what is really needed. And that's why today people think, I agree, with Wadia, that, this is really just the beginning. It's not really the end of the revolution, the beginning. Because people think that, holding elections in Egypt has ended that episode and that right now we have to forget about it. No. What we have seen in Egypt today, only the beginning. Of course, we've seen the election of a new president, but we did not resolve, the economic problems. We did not create new jobs. The economic situation today, after the revolution, is 10 times worse than the situation that existed before the revolution. And so it's very important that, one should really look into the ways how really to help in that sense and really to find, ways. Now what's happening, in Syria today is something different. But, at the beginning, the initial actions that were taken, in Egypt and in Tunisia were clearly asking for something completely different. Now, what we are seeing today in Libya or in other places, it's very clear that, what we are trying to see, that the internal divisions, the internal problems that used to be covered for so many years, right now they are emerging to the surface. And that, right now we are seeing, interfighting in Libya between tribes, and in other places, in Syria and other places. So it's very important that, whenever we talk about trying to understand the Arab Spring or Arab revolutions and to see what Europe could really do in order to help, it's very important first to understand what really has happened, what is really needed before we start really providing actions.
Well, Pierre, you said that it was Europeans who were expressing disillusionment and pessimism about the outcome of these revolutions. But it seems to me we've heard a lot of quite pessimistic interpretations from our Arab friends today. What do you think about that?
To answer directly the question, how do youth fight political Islam? To some extent, I don't understand the question. I don't think we have to fight political Islam. Political Islam is there; it's a fact, and we have to accept it. What I think we're saying in Europe, and I think exactly what the minister was just saying, is that all this will take time. To some extent, things have gone and have accelerated a bit too quickly. You know, democracy, as we all understand it, takes time. It has to do also with the capacity of a society to have citizens who take part in the political debate with an understanding of everything that is going on. And here in many of these countries, we're witnessing societies where political life was more or less, and political debate was more or less forbidden. So to go from nothing to everything is maybe going too quickly. Then you have the whole issue, of course, of the role and the place of religion in a political society. The whole issue about secularité and everything that deals with that. And of course, the European approach is very much different from the Arab approach. And there also, we all have to understand these differences, and once again to be able to listen to that. So I think that whether it be from our Arab friends or from the Europeans, for me the main conclusion is that we have to watch, monitor what is going on, but let's not try lecturing, and let's try to understand. Wait, could I just add one point and answer?
Please.
To say that the Arab League is less organized than the European Union, it's not very kind for the Arab League, and I must say no. I can't accept that.
Well, that's very obvious. I think you were anxious to say something.
Sometimes, you know, the EU and the Arab League sometimes are very similar. They agree not to agree, but a story is told on Moshe Dayan, the Minister of Defense. 2 days after the Six-Day War in 1967, some security service people came to him and said to him, "Look, the Arabs are preaching against us. What to do?" He said, what to do? You know, we just occupied everything. Let them talk and let us work. The same about women. They are leaving us talking and they are working. You know, now to talk about seriously, I believe that I don't say political Islam. We have to distinguish between political Islam and abuse of Islam. There are unfortunately different groups and individuals who are employing the religion, as it was the case in Europe in the medieval ages, as there are now several people in Israel who are abusing Judaism for various issues. You know, they think that God is working for their secretary. So I believe that there is a wave coming to the region, unfortunately, of fanaticism, partially due to external elements. But I do believe that we need 3 major stones to minimize the damage of this wave. One of them is women empowerment. Second, minorities. Minorities not in the sense to encourage sectarian approach, but in the sense to encourage minorities to be integral part in the society and to encourage majority to respect minority. And third, to engage in dialogue, not to have boycotts and preconditions like these 3 preconditions for talking with Hamas. You talk to everybody, you know, these are players in the ground. You talk to everybody and then you make your mind. Coming and boycotting X and Y, sometimes you are de facto helping him more than boycotting him.
Thank you. Mr. Abdi, I wonder if you agree with the statement of the minister that the revolution in Tunisia was only about jobs and not at all about democracy. I had a slightly different impression, but I'd like to hear yours.
Thank you. I do respect what Excellency the Minister had been arguing, but I do not agree. But let me tell you 2 stories. First, when I was in Japan, 2000, 2004, once back to Tunisia, a journalist asked me, what is the difference between being in Tunisia and being abroad when you miss Tunisia? I told him, abroad sometimes I cry because I miss Tunisia. In Tunisia once back, I'm crying every day. So this is second story. I'm the son of a militant. My father was a militant against the French colonization. And when the Bouazizi immolated himself in Sidi Bouzid, which is my village, I was in a meeting in the OECD in Paris. And my brother called me. I did not answer. Then he sent me an SMS. 1 hour later, my father called me and told me, you have to come back. There is a historical role, and you have to play it. You are the gift of the revolution. I went back. The Italian people, they know this. And I did play my role as it has to be, which is an actor, a coordinator of the revolution. When I was between my students and my compatriots in Sidi Bouzid, all slogans, they were not hungry, but they were hungry for democracy. This is true. They were hungry to preserve and to protect their dignity, which Ben Ali had damaged. This means that for us, this is a specific case. It could be a model of models, which is Tunisia. The revolution was, and I do reiterate, was for dignity and democracy. I cannot accept that the situation now is worse. No, never. Because now I'm breathing the democracy, I'm breathing the freedom, so even if people are going to be hungry, but there is something as a kind of compensation. What is the difference between our government now, elected government, and Ben Ali? And now I can answer my colleague. When we are speaking about leadership, for me it's an archaic notion. And category, also an archaic category. We do not need charismatic leader. Why? Because we are governing from governance. Ben Ali was ruling. He needed at that time an authority, and he needed to be authoritarian, to be above the Tunisian people. Now we need legitimacy, and we are legitimate. That's why we are not scared of the future. Also, something is the present is born from the matrix of the past. This is very important. Take it into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We also have a Deputy Minister from Egypt who I think it would be interesting to hear from on this subject. But briefly, please, because we are really at the end of our time.
Just in line with what has been just said by the Minister of State of Tunisia, what has been said about the Egyptian revolution and also the motivation was only economic. Unemployment and poverty is not accurate, because people in the Tahrir Square, since day one, they raised the slogan Aish, Hurriya, Adala, Ijtimaiya, means bread, freedom, and social justice. In Egypt, we are moving to lay the foundation of, for the first time in more than 60 years, to lay the foundation of a democratic Egypt, to lay the foundation of the rule of law, respect of human rights, and fundamental freedoms. What has been said that the economic situation in Egypt now is 10 times worse than before? Well, I don't know based on what it was said, but we are moving in the right direction. We have a free election. We have a newly elected president for the first time in our history. I'm talking not only in the last 60 years, but maybe 7,000 years. We have We have a good government, and we are moving in the right direction, and we need the support, the political, psychological, economic support. Democracy in Egypt has to succeed, and we don't want people to give us lessons or to impose opinions on us or to be that pessimistic. Give us time, and you will see the rise of Egypt like you are seeing now the rise of China, the rise of Brazil, the rise of other countries. You know, we are, after the rise of the West, we will be part of the rise of the rest. Give us hope, give us support, and we will do it. And you will see in the very near future a different Egypt playing a very important role, not only in the regional sphere, but also in the international level. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Ribal, this is not a discussion about your father, and I don't think you are obliged to reply to what was said about him, but you have the right to say something.
Yes.
We are going to close now, but I want to give you a chance.
Yes, please. Thank you very much. And you know, it's a great pleasure again to be able to respond. This is why we are fighting for democracy and freedom in my country and all over the Middle East. Yes,
please,
see,
this is why.
No, it's okay. You know, this is what we have, and this is why Syria is where it is today, because that's the example of opposition that we have in Syria. Everybody is working on hatred, on revenge, on sectarian issues, on whatever. Okay. Please, if I could speak, you know, in democracy, I give you your time, you should give me my time. You see, that's the beauty about democracy, is that, you know, you've lived in the West, I'm sure in the US, as I've heard, and you should have learned a bit about democracy, you know. That's my cousin. I've been fighting against my cousin. They tried to kill me in 1994 since I was a child. I left, I was 9.
I'm sorry, you had a very good chance to say your piece. Please let him reply.
I did not say revenge. I said fair trial.
I didn't say revenge. I'm saying I said the language. The language you're using, sir. Please, if you could relax and listen, you know. We are talking about the language you're using. Your father did this, your father did that. Did you give me a chance to defend myself? Did you ask about my father? My father, what you don't know, Mr. Abdullah, is my father left Syria in 1984. My father came out in November 2011, and it's all over the internet, YouTube, at a conference in Paris, and he says, I was never responsible for what happened in Hama, you know, and I would love if there's anybody who could, take me, or if there's anyone who would like to take me to trial, I'm ready to go. You know, he doesn't have a problem with that. My father was head of higher education, you know. He was also head of Unit 569, which was at the time acting as presidential guards, because presidential guards did not exist. Yeah, I'm sure you know that, or you're too young to know that. Please, if you let me continue. And you see, in democracy, you cannot throw allegation and throw wrong things, not based on facts, not based on facts. Sir, please, if there's anything, but why would they lie? Of course, would I be working for democracy, if you know, and freedom? If he did something wrong, would I be working for democracy and human rights? In democracy and human rights, if it was true, then I would sit quiet. I would live, you know, in some island and not be, seeing everywhere. I wouldn't be chairing the Arab News satellite TV channel ANN, which was the first Arab news network to promote democracy and freedom in Syria and the Middle East. And I'm sure some Arab people who are here on the panel know that. You know, so if we are promoting democracy and freedom, it is because this is what we want for our country. It's only a way out for our country. And in democracy and freedom, you're able, you know, we have nothing to hide. Please come, judge, you know, if you could take us to trial and have, you know, things, facts and proofs, we'd welcome it, please. Okay. It would be great. We'd love to. You know, but please learn about what the meaning of democracy first.
Okay.
Learn how to act in
the
system.
That's a good. Mark, do you want a last word?
Sure. Just as a wrap-up comment, I think one of the things I was talking about building trust, I think that's very important, is that we do actually always try as hard as possible to get clarity about the identities that we're speaking about. And I think there was the Clash of Civilizations thesis of Huntington, there was the Alliance of Civilizations, so the response of the United Nations, and Really, the one thing I would just, maybe to conclude, suggest as a word of caution when we're doing diplomacy or any kind of cultural diplomacies, I think one of the big tasks is really to distinguish, those identities themselves, not to talk about Western civilization or Islamic civilization, but really to take the time to actually consider the very unique nature of each of these individual identities. And I think that would be true whether it's the political diplomacy or the cultural diplomacy. And I think that's one of the challenges that we have in whether building dialogue, understanding, or trust. So, but I was encouraged really by many of the words from the panel, and very grateful for this discussion.
Okay. Well, I'm afraid we have run out of time. I'm very grateful to all the panelists and to the audience.
Very sorry.
Okay.
I have prepared 20 pages of speech, but I will summarize everything, don't worry.
Thank you.
Just a few seconds. My name is Laris Geiser, and I'm the acting president of the Euro-Mediterranean University that you introduced at the beginning. So I wanted just to take the occasion to thank you very much, all the present excellencies, ministries, and distinguished guests for the support to our institution. And I would like to finish this panel with a sort of positive sunshine, stressing that since 2008, we are a very well-working university, probably the only working project between European Union and the Arab world, and for sure the only platform, because we are a university and at the same time a sort of international organization, a platform of university and institutions, that is connecting 206 different universities and institutions. We are one of the few organizations bringing together Israel and Palestine. So I would like only to end this panel, if you allow me, reading the statement that is at the entrance of our university, and there is no point in dialogue if we are not prepared to change our mind and our preconceptions. Real dialogue takes time and trust. Those who agree to engage in it must have the assurance of a safe context and a guaranteed continuity. So, ladies and gentlemen, please continue to support our Euro-Mediterranean Emuni University forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So I would also like to end with some positive sunshine. Sunshine actually is a commodity with which the Arab countries are well provided. And one of the reasons that some of their economies have been in difficulty since these revolutions is that there's been a decline in tourism. So I think one very practical thing that we as individual Europeans could do is plan to take our holiday next year in an Arab country. And with that thought, I will thank you again and wish you a very good evening.
Very good idea. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Hello?
Yep. Thank you.